this video, I'm going to be speaking about e-bikes. And across things like what is an e-bike and what's not an e-bike, what types of e-bikes are there, and what benefits do they have. So what makes an e-bike an e-bike? So it's a pedal-assisted bicycle that doesn't exceed 25 kilometers, or in some other countries it can be 32 kilometers an hour, or whatever the equivalent is in miles. Now, what's not an e-bike is something that looks like a motorcycle that doesn't have pedals and exceeds 25 kilometers an hour, which if you have one of those, you may as well be riding a motorcycle around on the road. Here I'm going to be talking about the benefits of e-bikes. The first one across is balance. Now, someone who's a beginner who hasn't ridden for maybe 30 or 40 years and they want to jump on a bike, they may struggle to actually take off on a bike, which I've seen a number of times in the years I've been riding and being in the bike store. Now, with an e-bike, that initial takeoff is actually a lot easier, and what happens is you'll get up to speed quite quickly and the centrifugal force of the wheels will keep the bike upright. In turn, helps with someone who may have not very much confidence. The next benefit I want to talk about is the lower heart rate. There's quite a few benefits here. Now, if you're someone who's getting into it and you find that a normal bike, you just puffed out way too quickly and your heart rate's going through the roof and you're just uncomfortable. Now, an e-bike's gonna be less work for you, therefore your heart rate's gonna be lower, you're gonna be more enjoyable, you're not gonna be as puffed out. This is also really good for someone who maybe has short commutes and they don't want to be sweaty when they get to work. That's another benefit as well. So your lower heart rate, you're not sweating, you're not pushing too hard, you're still going to feel fresh when you get to work rather than worn out, particularly if you're riding 25 or 30 kilometers each way. The next one I want to talk about is skipping the shuttle or skipping the ride uphill. Now, this is more pointed towards the mountain bikers. So on a normal mountain bike, we ride up a hill, might take us half an hour, then we spend 10 minutes going back down. We could do probably four laps of those and we're done for the day. Or if you're really fit, you could probably do a few more than that. Now, there's another one we do as well, which is shuttling. We put our bikes onto a trailer, we get driven up to the top of the mountain, and we just continue doing laps that way. Now, if you have an e-bike, no shuttle required. You can ride up the hill. You can still jump on a shuttle if you wish, but you can ride up the hill nearly effortlessly, ride back down. And you could do quite a few laps until you run out of battery. And that goes the same as if we're pedaling uphill, you're going to get up to the top much quicker than if you didn't have a drive unit on your bike. So, in turn, more laps. Now I want to dive into the cons of e-bikes. Now, the first one across is they're much heavier. Something like 6 kilos is probably about the average difference between your standard bike and an e-bike of the similar type of bike, if that makes sense. Like an enduro versus an e-mountain bike that's enduro spec. It's probably going to be about 6 kilos. Bit more, bit less. Now, the problem you're going to have there is if you are doing shuttles and you're trying to lift the bike up onto the trailer, it's going to be a lot heavier, especially if you're doing it a few times, and lifting the bike on and onto bike racks, like on the back of your car or maybe on a roof, which I really don't recommend. I just might add, if you run out of battery, the bike is exceptionally hard to pedal, particularly if you're riding uphill. If you're riding downhill, not so much. But if it does run out of battery, you are pushing a lot more weight. The next kind I want to jump into is parts wear out a lot quicker. Now, this is probably more directed at mid-drive, but chains and cassettes and all the jockey wheels and the front sprocket are going to generally wear out faster because there's constant force going through that chain rather than pedaling. When you pedal in a circular motion, the wear of your chain only really starts from about here on the crank and goes about 90 degrees, and then that next little bit, there's not much force going through that chain. As where an e-bike, it's constant. It's constant force going through it, and also you putting in effort as well. So there's actually 2 factors wearing out that chain. Another thing as well is actually tires, rims, wheels, and everything like bearings and linkage systems. If you're on a dual suspension, everything is going through a lot more load, and not only because it's an extra 7 kilos or whatever it is, it's also the fact that there's more load going through the bike because of that 250 watt engine, and it's just more force going into the bike and wearing things out a little bit quicker. Now, it's not to say that an e-bike's going to wear out in 1 year versus 3 years. It's micro differences, but there's still the difference there, and that's something you do need to factor in. Another con that I want to go across, it's another part to go wrong. So with already stuff that can go wrong with a normal bike, an e-bike just brings that one extra component that can go wrong, like drive unit failure or a magnet failure or a sensor failure or something like that, which is it's not gonna upset the bike, and it's not like you're not going to be able to ride it, but it might put the drive unit into lit mode and you're just riding a heavy unassisted bike. Now, the last con I want to cross is the bikes can actually be harder to work on. Now, let's use a mid-drive as an example here. If you want to replace the gear cable, usually they'll run underneath the drive unit, and you have to drop that out to actually replace it. Now, something that should only be a 20-minute job can turn into an hour or maybe 2 hours just to that factor, because they are so fiddly and it's got to be in the right place, and it's very easy to squish that cable. The next example I can use is like a hub drive. Let's use a rear wheel as an example. Now, there's going to be cables and wiring that's connected to that hub because it's a rear hub driven wheel. Sometimes that cable can be right next to on the chainstay, or sometimes it can be buried deep inside the bottom bracket. And if they're in the bottom bracket, it can be an absolute pain to remove, and just so you can change the tube. Now, the next piece I want to talk about is the types of e-bikes there are. When I talk about that is where the drive unit or the motor is actually placed. Now, there is 3 types. There's mid-drive, there's rear hub driven, and there's a front hub drive one, which you don't see a lot of anymore. And I'm going to go through the pros and cons of each of those. First one I'm across is mid-drive systems. Now, mid-drive means that the motor or the drive unit is sitting where your cranks are, where you pedal the bike. And what that does, it turns the front chain wheel, which in turn drives your chain and assists by pushing the rear wheel, as if you were riding the bike normally, but you get an assistance from the drive unit. Now, the pros to that is that the drive unit's actually sitting a bit lower than a hub-driven unit, and that means lower center of gravity. The next bit is, because it's in the center of the bike, we've got a centered weight. So the weight's not too far at the back or too far at the front. It's centered in the middle, which makes it handle a bit more like a normal bike. And lastly, the wheels remove like a normal bike, so they're quite easy to remove. No different to a normal bike. The cons of a mid-drive unit. So the first one I'll talk about is the crankset is drive unit specific. Sometimes that can be a little bit confusing, and there is a few different types of fittings that may actually look the same, but they're slightly different diameter, maybe a mil or 2 out, which in turn, if you get the wrong one, it's a very expensive part just to buy and then have to return and try and find the correct one. Now, your bike store should know which one you need, but there's bike shops out there that perhaps don't know too much about this thing, although they're getting much better at it because it's becoming more normal. This is where 5 years ago it was a bit unknown. The next one I want to talk about is wearing chains and cassettes. Now, I did talk about this earlier, but I've heard of 300 to 500 Ks on mountain bikes running turbo mode. They just absolutely chew them, especially 12-speed systems. Now, while you can sort of baby them a little bit and they'll last longer, but in my experience, they get replaced out quite quickly because there's so much force going through that chain and cassette. The last one is they're an expensive bike. So if you're comparing to like a hub drive bike, the prices of them are quite a lot. Maybe starting at about $4,500 and works their way up to even $20,000 for something really high end. But most of the stuff you're looking at is somewhere around about that $4,000 to $8,000, and yeah, they can be an expensive investment, but they are high quality. Now I want to speak about rear hub. So compared to your mid-drive, the drive unit, or the motor if you like, is actually a part of your hub in the rear wheel. Now, how that works is there's a sensor that senses when you pedal and will put power to the back wheel. And this is also the case for front hub as well. What happens is pedal, it pushes directly from the wheel. So a few pros with that is that the chain actually lasts longer. So the chain doesn't go through excessive force like a mid-drive, because you initially pedal the bike and it puts power to the back wheel or the front wheel to front hub, and that power kicks in and doesn't actually put wear on your chain. You're only doing the wear on your chain from pedaling it, and it means you have to put less energy into pedaling it. In turn, chains will last longer and not stretch as much. The next one across is the bikes are usually cheaper. Now, this is a pro and a con a little bit. The bikes are more budget friendly. You can buy them for $2,000. I've even seen them for maybe $1,500. And what this means is you can get into the market much sooner than your mid-drive systems. Now, that's not always the case, but this is just what I've seen in the bicycle industry within the bike shops I've worked at. Now, the cons of a rear hub motor is the bike's going to be rear heavy, meaning that the bike's not going to be really balanced. It's not going to handle like a normal bike. You're going to feel that rear end a little bit more if you're sensitive to bikes, or if you're a small frame person. The next one's going to be wheels harder to remove. I spoke about this earlier. You have to remove the cables or the wiring to actually get the wheel off. The last one I go across is the cassette can be harder to remove. Now, a standard cassette removal tool may not work depending on what sort of rear hub you have. Sometimes it's been okay, but there has been some cheaper ones, like Bafang is one, I believe, that you can't actually get the tool on there. So you need to actually have a specific tool to take it off, which can be a bit annoying. And if you got the tools at home, you have that bike, you go to remove it yourself, and you realise you need to go down the rabbit hole of finding that tool, which can be a little bit difficult because it's not standard. And when you go ask for a cassette removal tool, chances are that the bike shop's going to offer you the one you've already got, or just a standard one that doesn't fit. Now, lastly, you got front hub, which means that the motor or the drive unit's actually in the front wheel. Now, this shares similar pros and cons to the rear wheel, except for maybe cassette removal, because you don't have a cassette there driving that front wheel. But one con that the front hub drive has that mid or rear doesn't have is that the front wheel, when it's slippery, can actually spin up and skate around on you, which it's only in slippery conditions, and it's probably why you're not seeing them as much as what we used to when they first started coming out. But when you take off and then the front tries to skid around, you understeer, it can be a bit sketchy. So that's probably why we're not seeing them much in the industry now. So that's it for e-bikes. I hope you learned something here. Now, it has its place in the industry. It's not for everyone, and that's perfectly fine. I hope you've learned something about e-bikes, and if you are looking to get an e-bike, I hope this gives you a bit of insight to what to look for when looking at an e-bike, and the pros and the cons of each type. If you have any comments or feedback or any other video ideas, give us a comment below. Give me a like and subscribe. Share the video as well with your mates, and I'll see you in the next one.